Hello, my name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 56. With our play today, the basis for multiple films and plays and adaptations focused on leadership, revenge, deception, cold-blooded murder, corruption, and power, including my personal favorite adaptation, the 1985 film Ron, by the late, great Akira Kurosawa, William Shakespeare's The Tragedy of King Lear. Now, today, we're going to be reading the Folger Shakespeare Library Edition, which I would encourage you to go ahead and pick up. And we are going to be joined today on the podcast by our returning guest co-host from episode number 43, where we broke down the reality of human leadership through the lens of politics and economics by reading The Road to Serfdom by F.A. Hayek. I would encourage you to go back and listen to that episode. And I'd like to welcome back to the podcast today, Libby Unger. How you doing, Libby?
I am doing terrific. I'm really excited for King Lear.
Now, Shakespeare, we've been doing a month of Shakespeare. We've covered Hamlet, we've covered Taming of the Shrew, and now we're getting into King Lear. Othello is upcoming. Very excited to cover that one as well. Shakespeare, of course, Shakespeare's plays, of course, lay at the root of all human behavior and all human understanding, and have influenced the West, as I said on the episode where we discussed Hamlet, have influenced human nature, have influenced how our Western understanding of human nature, and quite frankly, our Western understanding of everything that comes out of human nature, including leadership, for, the last 400 years. And so with that, I would like to open from, once again, the Folger Library Edition of King Lear. We're going to start off with Act 1, Scene 1. And we're going to begin with Lear's comments as Cornwall, Albany, Goneril, his daughter, Regan, his other daughter, Cordelia, his other daughter, and some attendants enter the throne room. Lear: attend the lords of France and Burgundy. Gloucester. I shall, my lord. He exits. Lear: meantime, we shall express our darker purpose. Give me that map here. He's handed a map. Know that we have divided in our three kingdoms, and 'tis our fast intent to shake all cares and business from our age, conferring them on younger strengths, while we unburdened crawl toward death. Our son of Cornwall, and you, our no less loving son of Albany, we have this hour a constant will to publish our daughter's several dowers, that future strife may be prevented now. The two great princes, France and Burgundy, great rivals in our youngest daughter's love, long in our court, have made their amorous sojourn, and here are to be answered. Tell me, my daughters, since we will now divest us both of rule, interest of territory, cares of state, which of you shall we say doth love us most, that we our largest bounty may extend, where nature doth with merit challenge? Goneril, our eldest born, speak first. Goneril: sir, I love you more than word can wield the matter, dearer than eyesight, space, and liberty, beyond what can be valued rich or rare, no less than life with grace, health, beauty, honor, as much as a child e'er loved or father found, a love that makes breath poor and speech unable, beyond all manner of so much I love you. Cordelia aside: what shall Cordelia speak? Love and be silent? Lear, pointing at the map: of all these bounds, even from this line to this, with shadowy forests and with champaigns rich, with plenteous rivers and wide-skirted meads, we make thee lady. To thine and Albany issue be this perpetual. What says our second daughter, our dearest Regan, wife of Cornwall? Speak. Regan: I am made of that self-metal as my sister, and prize me at her worth. In my true heart I find she names my very deed of love, only she comes too short, that I profess myself an enemy to all other joys, which the most precious square of sense possesses, and find I am alone felicitate in your dear highness's love. Cordelia aside: then poor Cordelia, and yet not so, since I am sure my love's more ponderous than my tongue. Lear, to thee and thine heredity ever remain this ample third of our fair kingdom, no less in space, validity, and pleasure than that conferred on Goneril. Now our joy, although our last and least, to whose young love the vines of France and milk of Burgundy strive to be interest. What can you say to draw a third more opulent than your sisters? Speak. Cordelia. Nothing, my lord. Lear. Nothing? Cordelia. Nothing. Lear. Nothing will come of nothing. Speak again. Cordelia. Unhappy that I am, I cannot leave my heart into my mouth. I love your majesty according to my bond, no more and no less. Lear. How, Cordelia, mend your speech a little, lest you may mar your fortunes. Cordelia. Good, my lord, you have begot me, bred me, loved me. I return those duties back as are right fit. Obey you, love you, and most honor you. Why have my sisters husbands if they say they love you all? Haply, when I say I shall wed, that lord whose hand must take my plight shall carry half my love with him, half my care and duty. Sure, I shall never marry like my sisters, to love my father all. Lear. But goes thy heart with this? Cordelia. Eh, my good lord. Lear. So young and so untender. Cordelia. So young, my lord, and true. Lear. Let it be so. Thy truth then be thy dower. For by the sacred radiance of the sun, the mysteries of Hecate and the night, by all the operations of the orbs from whom we do exist and cease to be, here I disclaim all my paternal care, propinquity and property of blood, and as a stranger to my heart and me, hold thee from this forever, the barbarous Scythian, or he that makes his generation messes to gorge his appetite, shall to my bosom be as well neighbored, pitied, and relieved as thou, my sometime daughter. Kent. Good, my liege. Lear. Peace, Kent. Come now, not between the dragon and his wrath. I love her most, and thought to set my rest on her kind nursery. To Cordelia. Hence, and avoid my sight. So be my grave, my peace. Here, as I give her father's heart from her. Call France, who stirs. Call Burgundy. An attendant exits. Cornwall and Albany, with my two daughters, dowers, digest the third. Let pride, which she calls plainness, marry her. I do invest you jointly with my power, preeminence, and all the large effects that troop with majesty. Ourself by monthly course with reservations of 100 knights. By you be sustained shall our abode, make with you by due turn. Only we shall retain thy name and all the addition to a king, the sway, revenue, execution of the rest. Beloved sons be yours, which to confirm this coronet part between you. There's a lot there. And I just sort of ran through, folks. And then we've been doing a month of Shakespeare. This is how it goes. I put the Shakespeare voice on. You got to throw it out there a little bit. You got to do the sort of Orson Welles / English actor. Patrick Stewart comes to mind. You got to sort of do that kind of thing. You got to give it a little flourish, because Shakespeare cannot be read in merely a plain voice. But after all of the flourishes, after all the exaggeration, I know why teenagers struggle with King Lear. There's a lot of complicated things going on here, and quite frankly, flattery, and this is maybe the first thing that we get from King Lear, flattery will apparently get you everywhere in business, just as it will in royalty. Leaders, to get what you want, engage in flattery, right? Turns out that narcissism is not a modern psychological state. It's just moved from being a private act tinged with shame to being a shameless public act, right? We're not shameless in our narcissism. We put it out there. We want it to be publicly applauded. Goneril and Reagan, at least, had the good grace to keep it private. The other thing that we get from that big opening act where Lear is trying to divide up his kingdom is this concept, and we toyed with it a little bit in Hamlet, and we're going to toy with it a little bit more in Othello, and of course it pops up in Julius Caesar. But Shakespeare was very much concerned, as should leaders, about this idea of beguiling or deceiving another person. Reagan and Goneril and their husbands, in particular Cornwall, he's going to prove to be a problem later on. they engage in acts of deception. They engage in acts of beguiling King Lear. Now, you could say, of course, that King Lear deserved to be beguiled. He wasn't going to listen to honest feedback from Cordelia when she said she had nothing for him other than her mere honor and her love and her truth to give him. And beguiling a person in power to attain the power that they have, which is what Goneril and Regan are involved in this little clip here right at the beginning, the opening of King Lear. If you do that, it's a robust short-term tactic, but it's a poor long-term strategy. Unless, of course, your fundamental philosophy is establishing a tyranny with you the top of the hierarchy. And this is where we open. This is where Shakespeare starts us off in the journey in through 5 acts, as usual, of King Lear, a man who is going to find out exactly what it's like to fall off the top of a mountain, and how many people did you meet going all the way back down. As I said before, we have Libby Unger here, and we were talking about the road to serfdom, as I mentioned previously in episode number 43, and King Lear ties weirdly into the road to serfdom. I think Hayek would appreciate us reading this, because it's not necessarily about the economics of power, although that does sort of come into it, particularly in this first part here with the division of property. But there's also an element here of human nature, which Hayek touches on extensively in Serfdom, particularly in his chapter about why the worst always get to the top. And so let's start off with Libby here as we open with King Lear. I guess our first question is, Libby, why doesn't anyone read Shakespeare anymore? I've been asking almost everybody that since we started this little trot this month on the podcast through the works of Shakespeare, and we'll revisit Shakespeare again. There's just too much good stuff inside of all of his work to miss. But why doesn't anyone read Shakespeare anymore?
That is a very good question. I think it simply comes down to the language is foreign. It really is like a foreign language that you need to be introduced to through guidance and with teachers and education. It's like French. I'm not going to learn French or I may, but it'd be a lot easier to learn French with guidance and instruction. The story and the lessons of King Lear have been modernized, so we haven't necessarily lost the lessons. You spoke of Ron, but I was thinking even more recently of Succession.
I was, we brought up Succession. Interestingly enough, we brought up Succession in our episode on Hamlet with Tom Libby. I think Hamlet skews more towards something like Sons of Anarchy. That's more like Hamlet, but with a biker gang, right? Which I also said on the podcast. But yeah, you're right. King Lear is interesting because it is Succession. And I don't think the father, and I've never watched Succession on HBO, I've just seen clips and I've seen trailers floating around. I got the general gist of kind of what the show is about. But it is this idea of building an empire, and then how the hell do you divide it up? Like because you're not going to live forever. And at a certain point, you have to give it away. Like you have to divest yourself of your property. And this is a real problem.
Yeah, well, let's step back and you've got the lessons of, Succession is teaching the lessons of King Lear and the human nature. The builder creates a huge fiefdom. He wants it to continue and to thrive, and his successors are well positioned to do that, although they didn't learn the tricks of the trade. And how to build, and they're overconfident in their capabilities and competencies. And what becomes of them, they let their greed start to dictate their actions, and ultimately they lie and cheat in order to retain power or to hold on to the last grasp of it.
Yeah.
But you've got Succession, but you've got Dallas, and you've got Dynasty. Dallas in the 1980s, right? Same thing.
Same thing.
But,
Yeah.
but what's so beautiful about Shakespeare and the classics, and what you're trying to do through these podcasts, is it really demonstrates that human nature is a constant, right? So the same tendencies that the powerful had back in the 1600s are the same ones that we're having in 2020. So why is it that Orwell and Ayn Rand could so accurately predict, where we would be landing as a society 80 to 100 years from when they were living?
Okay, let me ask you this follow-up question, because this is the key crux question.
Yeah.
Okay. I am old enough, and you are old enough to remember an analog time before all this digital nonsense, right? We're both in that weird sort of middle ground generation, right? Analog, then digital, and now we got to adapt, right? And there's a fundamental hubris that's built into digital, and we're seeing this right now with large language models being called artificial intelligence. And the fundamental hubris is a lack of being, not even a lack of being. It's the desire now for every individual to never be forgotten. Like, one of the things
Right.
that I tell folks is, and I do have this written into my will. I want to be erased from the internet when I'm gone. I want to be eliminated. I don't want to show up in some deep fake video 100 years from now. And I think I maybe said this on the podcast, but like selling Nestle, because like Nestle's pushed everything out to the edges, and like now they've got to grab like regular people, and I'm in the background of a crowd somewhere, or because my voice is around everywhere. This is brought to you by, I don't want any of that, right? Erase me, move me from the internet. But the fundamental hubris of our time is that technology has allowed us to believe that we can, that we are King Lear, right? That we're at the top of our own little pile. And now we can sort of do these things. And it used to be, when we were more tragically focused, or maybe not tragically focused, we were more acknowledging of the tragic nature of humanity, that we were like, no, there has to be boundaries. Like, that's for those people over there. And we still do have a lot of that. There's for that, but for us over here, there's something different. And we can look at it, right? Like, I think of, this is now the second time these people have made it on the podcast, but okay. Harry and Meghan, the Markle twins over there. Yeah, those two people. And yeah. If y'all find me, you can come sue me. It's fine, whatever. Good luck. But the dynamic there of, oh, well, that's those people over there doing that thing, but I'm living over here doing this thing, has sort of become wrapped up with this narcissistic hubris. That's why I opened up with narcissism, this narcissistic hubris because of technology. Like, if I can build my own reality on Facebook, then why shouldn't I be King Lear?
The digital age, I've shared this with a lot of folks over the years, is that it's distance perception from reality. So we have the perception that we're more important than we are.
Yeah.
Either good or bad. There's this perception that we're bigger and more powerful than we are.
Mm-hmm.
And Oprah used to talk about this, which is whenever you're trying to analyze someone's behavior, recognize that we all just want to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
And the digital feed, it used to be that we were seen in our local communies.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. At grade school, in the schoolyard, or at church, or in Girl Scouts or Cub Scouts, and we got rapid feedback, but it was real and untinged. So
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't this narcissistic like that was ephemeral.
Mm-hmm.
You can feel it in your soul. You could feel it viscerally. And you knew the person, so you actually would have to face them day in and day out. On the digital world, the feedback we're getting is from anonymous folks. And
Right.
if you say something negative, there's no consequences for your action, because you don't have to be with them or interact with them in a real human way anymore. But there's this perception that if I say something true, it is. And we're completely being divorced from reality as it is in this digital world. The narcissism, I think it is actually fueled economically as well. You and I both touch the VC and tech space, where all these folks are being given free money. They can blow up their companies, and they're given another job, doing the same thing. 6 months from then, they aren't actually having to deliver anything other than growth. They're not thinking about sustainability and delivering a viable business. It's just, look at me, I'm raising money. I'm building something big, but they're not thinking about the bigger picture. Who am I building it for?
Right.
It's more about, look at me, I'm important. Forbes 30 under 30, throw up, like don't know squat in your 20s.
Well, I talked about this on the Shorts episode. It came out this Tuesday, right? Ahead of the Shorts episode number 75. You go back and listen to this. But it is this idea, and it's also wrapped up with what you're saying of, and I keep going back to this over and over again, because I'm working on something here philosophically and rhetorically out loud with folks.
Right.
It's this idea of the adults in the room. So I look at lists like 30 under 30, 40 under 40, for God's sakes. I just got an email the other day. Could we interview you about being 50 under 50?
Yeah.
And I went down, and I immediately deleted it. What are we doing? Right.
Yeah.
So there was a dynamic in our culture. And I said this on our Shorts episode, and I think it bears repeating. There was a dynamic where you would never trust anyone. No, not never trust. You would never give power to any, right. You would never trust anyone over 30. But that was also in tension against the dynamic in the post-World War II era of, don't you dare give anybody any power who's under 40, because they can't handle it. Because there was something going to get tragic, right, about that. And we see this in Reagan and Goneril in King Lear, right? Yes, all the Shakespeare parts are played by young men, young boys, usually 16 to 19. Yes, okay, got it. And yes, they would have been a 16-year-old boy playing Reagan and a 16-year-old boy playing Goneril. Okay, got it. Yeah, I'm aware of all that in the Globe Theater and in the Elizabethan theater age, right? I'm aware of all this. My point is, the people as characters, right, are young and arrogant. They're under 40. They're not behaving with wisdom, right? That's the whole setup for Lear. It's the whole setup for Succession. It's the whole setup for another show that's very popular, which is shocking to me. My wife and I watched, I think, the first 2 episodes of the first season, and then my wife was like, "These are bad people. I don't need to have these people in my house." So we never went back to it again. But Yellowstone, a show that has just blown up, but it's basically King Lear. With Costner at the top of the hierarchy, right?
There's a couple threads in here that I think are really important, and I think there is always a really good tension between the young and the old, and I think it's an important tension. But this is why it's so important to understand history, to understand your own behaviors and your own tendencies, so that you are able to put a check on yourself. One is this concept around humility. 99 billion people have walked the planet. Why do you think your name is going to stand out in history? Right? But when you're always moving, when you're not reflecting, when you're not stepping back to assess the environment and to assess what's happening in context of a greater history, you will have the inclination to let your ego self lead. And your ego self is about me, status. And there are some benefits from, a heavy ego from a survival perspective. But in the world that we live in now, it can be very self-destructive and destructive to others. And in this digital world where we all get these rapid feedbacks, positive or negative, in the digital world, we do feel a lot more important than we actually are.
Right.
And, I had this, there's two things that are standout thoughts that have occurred to me and been important, through my evolution as a human. And the first is remembering a statement that my stepmother said to me when I was young. She said, in my 20s, I thought I knew it all. In my 30s, I realized I didn't, but I thought I could. And in my 40s and thereafter, I realized that I would never know it all. So it's so freeing to recognize how little you actually know and how much you have to discover about life. Now, that can be scary if you live in a fear-based control need environment, or it can be extremely freeing if you're always recognize that there's only room to grow.
Mm-hmm.
The second was after my own CEO stint, and I got caught up in, even though I had always viewed myself as a servant leader,
Mm-hmm.
I had started to move into this more narcissistic world,
Mm-hmm.
which is easy when you live in the Bay Area and everyone around you is, what are you doing? You're getting funding, you're working for VC, I'm building the next big company. And it can be overly consuming where you define yourself by your title and your role and not who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And when I moved on from that, I started asking myself, what is my legacy? And I'll go back to Oprah again. I really miss Oprah. And she was talking about how Maya Angelou, how she had told Maya Angelou that this school that she's building in South Africa was going to be her legacy. And Maya said, you don't know what your legacy will be. And I always thought, Oprah, your legacy is everyone who watches you. You taught me about, Michael Singer and, Eckhart Tolle and all these other amazing things. Your destiny legacy are the small moments. And honestly, over the last 5 years, it is the small moments that make a difference. It's the small moments that have a ripple and butterfly effect through life in people's lives. How you treat someone when you're in the grocery line and they're having a bad day could completely shift their day and the knock-on effects that impact they have on others. So the humility is in actually realizing how small you are, but how much power you have in the small moments versus the big ones.
And that's a good reminder for folks with ambition, leaders with ambition. Ambition is I'm going to paraphrase from Base Camp here. They're talking about VC. Ambition's a hell of a drug.
And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but checking your intentions. And that's the important thing, is your intentions to, and this is where we always see those executives who, before they were executives, are like, I'm going to, spend all my time, helping develop talent and making sure everyone gets paid right and gets opportunities. And then once they're in their roles, they're looking up to the next thing and they've forgotten who's behind them.
Yep.
So ambition about building big businesses. Why? Because you have a great product for your customer. You're providing jobs in a great place, jobs so people can put food on their family's table. It's all about the intention behind the ambition. What we have today, and this is where like the fourth turning, I think, plays a big picture. What we're seeing in King Lear too, is that, the people aren't building or creating, and what they're chasing becomes smaller. And so they become more vigilant. They're like, if they're defining themselves by their position and their power, then they're going to start, and that's all that matters. And that's when the tyrannical and authoritarian traits start to come into play. Yeah.
Well, because you have to, you're
not willing to step aside.
Well, not only that, but you're constantly mounting a defilade rear focused defense on an incredibly tiny slice of an incredibly shrinking fat head.
Yeah.
And when you're mounting that rear facing defense, you're so afraid of the future that you can't let go. And so now you're trapped, right? Because your hands are full of the thing you have now. And I'm kind of a little bit in this moment now, as I'm kind of talking to myself a little bit. But you're kind of in a little bit in this moment right now with some things, but you're so holding on so hard to the thing you've got now, but you have to let it go to grab onto something else. I think of I think of grappling, or I think of jiu-jitsu, right? I'm always going to bring up jiu-jitsu at least once in a podcast, and this is going to be the moment. But in jiu-jitsu, if you're in a bad position, and this is one of the lessons like I've had to learn, and it's really hard to learn. Like when you first start, when you're a white belt and it sucks and you're getting crushed like all the time, you want to just hold on for dear life. It's like a roller coaster ride. Like, yeah, I got this one hand in here. I'm holding on. I'm never letting go, right? But the reality is you have to let go. You have to have the bravery, the courage to let go of that position to find something else, because you only have two hands. That's it. That's all you got.
It's the concept of what you resist persists.
Correct. Yes.
Right.
That's
and
right.
if you just step back and let go, and have trust that the good things will follow, it's amazing what will happen. It's a scarcity mindset and a fixed state mindset that puts you into a tyrannical and authoritarian kind of world.
Yeah. Well, and we see this with Lear in his behavior. And now there's always usually a check on that. And I want to talk about the blindness of hierarchies. Because when Lear is challenged a little bit in his decision making, he doesn't really like that. And he kind of sort of pulls the old card of not the old card, but he pulls the card of, I'm in charge. I get to make this decision, and I get to decide what happens with my lands and how it's going to go. And there's a check in the court there. And that check is, as it is in our own society and culture, and I think this was something important that Shakespeare picked up on. The check was the comedian or the fool, right? The fool, right? Fool is critically important psychologically. The fool is also important for leaders. And it's important in order to wake up those who are at the top of the hierarchy with the all-seeing eye to the fact that they might not be seeing all the things that they think they're seeing. And so let's talk about the blindness of hierarchies. Let's go back to King Lear a little bit. Let's open up with Act 1, Scene 4. And this is where King Lear is talking to the fool, and the fool's poking him a little bit in his court, which is, by the way, the fool's job. By the way, the modern fool is Dave Chappelle. That's the modern fool, or Chris Rock, right? You keep your hands off the fool, Will Smith. He has a right to be, or Joe Rogan. That's right. That's right. That's right. He has a right to be in the court. You need him there. Act 1, Scene 4 of King Lear. Enter fool. Fool, let me hire him too, to Kent. Here's my coxcomb. He offers Kent his cap. Lear. How now, my pretty Dave? How dost thou? Fool, to Kent. Sirrah, you were best bet take my coxcomb. Lear. Why, my boy? Fool. Why? For taking one's part that's out of favor, to Kent. Nay, and thou canst not smile as the wind sits. Thou wilt catch a cold shortly. Here, there, take my coxcomb. Why, this fellow has banished 2 sons and daughters, and did the third a blessing against his will. If thou follow him, thou must needs wear my coxcomb. How now, nuncle? Would I had 2 coxcombs and 2 daughters? Lear. Why, my boy? Fool. If I gave them all my living, I'd keep my coxcombs myself. There's mine. Beg another of thy daughters. Lear. Take heed, sirrah, the whip. Fool. Truth's a dog must to kennel. He must be whipped out, when the Lady Brock may stand by the fire and stink. Lear. A pestilent gall to me. Fool. Sirrah, I'll teach thee a speech. Lear. Do. Fool. Mark it, nuncle. Have more than thou showest. Speak less than thou knowest. Lend less than thou owest. Ride more than thou goest. Learn more than thou trowest. Set less than thou throwest. Leave thy drink and thy whore, and keep in a door, and thou shalt have more than 2 tens to a score. Kent, this is nothing, fool. Fool, then 'tis like the breath of an unfettered lawyer. You gave me nothing for it? Can you make no use of nothing, uncle? Lear, why no, boy, nothing can be made out of nothing. Fool to Kent, tell him, so much the rent of his land comes to, he will not believe a fool. Lear, a bitter fool. Fool, dost thou know the difference, my boy, between a bitter fool and a sweet one? Lear, no, lad, teach me. Fool, that lord that counseled thee to give away thy land, come place him here by me, do thou for him to stand. The sweet and bitter fool will presently appear, the one in motley here, the other found out there. Lear, dost thou call me a fool, boy? Fool, all other titles thou hast given away, that thou was born with. Kent, this is not altogether fool, my lord. Fool, no faith, lords and great men will not let me. If I had a monopoly out there, they would have part on it. And ladies too, they will not let me have all the fool to myself. They'll be snatching. Uncle, give me an egg, and I'll give thee 2 crowns. Lear, what 2 crowns shall they be? Fool, why, after I have cut the egg in the middle, eat up the meat, the 2 crowns of an egg. When thou clovest thy crown in the middle, and gavest away both parts, thou borest thine ass on thy back o'er the dirt. Thou hast little wit in thy bald crown, when thou gayest the golden one away. If I speak like myself in this, let him be whipped that first finds it. Fools have nevertheless grace in a year, for wise men are grown foppish, and know not how their wits to wear, their manners are so appish. Lear, when were you wont to be full of songs, sirrah? Fool, I have used it, uncle, ever since thou amassed thy daughters, thy mothers. For when thou gavest them the rod, and puttest down thine own breeches, he sings, then they for sudden joy did weep, and I for sorrow sung, that such a king should play Bo Peep, and go the fools among. Prithee, uncle, keep a schoolmaster that can teach thy fool to lie. I would fain to learn to lie. Lear, and you lie, sirrah, we'll have you whipped. Fool, I marvel what kin thou and thy daughters are. They'll have me whipped for speaking true. They'll have me whipped for lying. And sometimes I am whipped for holding peace. I'd rather be any kind of thing other than a fool, and yet I would not be thee uncle. Thou hast parred thy wit on both sides and left nothing in the middle. Ah, here comes one of the pairings. Enter Goneril. Lear, hey now, my daughter, what makes that frontlet on? Methinks you are too much late in thy frown. Fool, that was a pretty fellow when thou hadst no need to care for her frowning. Now thou art without a figure. I am better than thou art now. I am a fool, thou art nothing. To Goneril, yes, forsooth, I will hold my tongue. See, your face bids me, though you say nothing. Mum, mum. He that keeps nor crust nor crumb, weary of all, shall want some. He points at Lear. That's a shelled peace cod. Goneril, not only, sir, is this your all licensed fool, but other of your insolent retinue do hourly carp and quarrel, breaking forth in rank, and not to be endured riots. Sir, I had thought by making this well known unto you to have found a safe redress, but now grow fearful by what yourself too late have spoken and done, that you protect this course and put it on by your allowance, which if you should, the fault would not scape censure, nor the redress sleep, which in the tender of a wholesome weal might in their working do you that offense, which else were shame, that then necessity will call discreet proceeding. Fool, for you know, nuncle, the hedge sparrow feed the cuckoo so long that it's had its head bit off by it young. So went out the candle, and we were left darkling. Now, granted, there's a lot there. The fool's it took me a couple of readings of that to kind of grab what the fool was doing, but there's a couple of things there. And, well, the biggest thing, I think, if you look at Act 1, scene 4, the biggest thing there is this idea, and you get it with Lear first, but then with Gloucester later, of blindness. And the fool is trying to point out something, because the fool is the one who can see. The fool is the one who can observe. The fool is the one who can, well, successfully point out when the king has no clothes. The Earl of Gloucester loses his eye in Act 3, Scene 7. You may want to go back and take a look at that. We're not going to read the whole play today, as usual, and I always say that. The Folgo Shakespeare Library is a great library version of Shakespeare, is a great version to pick up. And of course, we cannot read the whole play, so we're dipping in, dipping out. We're making our points. But go back and read it. The Earl loses his eye in Act 3, Scene 7, which put me in mind, as I was reading also what the Fool was talking about here and trying to get King Lear to open up both of his eyes. I was put in mind of the blind Oedipus at Colonus by Sophocles. And in that play, one of my personal favorites, part of the triumvirate of Sophocles plays about Oedipus, the man who killed his own father and, well, married his own mother and forgot the riddle of the Sphinx. Oedipus at Colonus, when he's blind, he asks the chorus, "Men of Colonus, how was I innately evil?" Or other translations, "Men of Colonus, how was I evil?" Lear, in his interactions with the fool, actually doesn't understand how he's evil. He doesn't understand how he's missing it. He doesn't see what the fool sees. He's beginning the psychological blindness that will eventually wind up in physical blindness at the end of the play. There's also something here about the Western eye that is very important for us to point out, for me to point out to you, and for us to note as leaders. If you look through Western literature, the eye is dominant, particularly in Western art forms, almost all Western art forms going back to Egypt, but really hyper dominant in Western literature. So it's not just a blind Oedipus at Colonus or the all-seeing eye in an Egyptian hieroglyphic. It's also at the top of Sauron's tower in Lord of the Rings, there's an all-seeing eye. And of course, in the myth of Osiris, the god is depicted as a disembodied eye. And of course, the Western view of art, we always say that we are affixing a piece of art with our gaze. There's something fundamental here in the West. It's not in the East. And King Lear, Shakespeare's grabbing onto this, right? He's grabbing onto this idea that cold, calculating, and scientific realism, represented by a guy like Edmund, and we'll talk a little bit about Edmund later on, it's not seeing enough. And that Lear's ultimate sin might be that he didn't recognize that the higher up you go in a hierarchy, the blinder and more fragile you become. A lot of different threads and thoughts in that. But let me close with this. I got to admit, and I'm going to go on record about this, and I've never gone on record about this before on the podcast, so this will be a first. I don't know why I feel compelled to go on record about this now, but I do, so I'm going to go with it. I'm not gigantically worried about one world government. Don't get me wrong. Guys like Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum, the people who believe they are the masters of the universe, the people who are in governmental bureaucracies behaving with corporations in a fascistic manner all over the globe, manipulating currencies and doing things in the dark that should not be spoken of in the light. Don't get me wrong. Those are folks to pay attention to, and those are things to be worried about. I'm not naive, nor am I stupid to those dangers, and they should be battled at every step of the way. But I don't think it's going to work, because the eye becomes blind the higher up the tower it goes. How exactly are you going to control 9 billion people? Actually, I have an even more important question than that. If you can't even control a nation state of 2 million, or a locality of 50,000, or a tribe of 500, when you go to scale, the arrogance and hubris that you will be able to control, whether through electronic, economic, or psychological means, falls apart. This is why I'm not worried about one world government. And don't get me wrong, I used to be very worried about it, and now not so much, because of the fragility of that all-seeing eye. Anyway, leaders. What can leaders take from this? How do leaders keep their sight, Libby? How do they maintain vision? And by the way, what's the role, a sub-question, what's the role of the fool in the court of the CEO these days, particularly when we're all doing DE&I and trying to sanitize everything?
Yeah, these are all really good questions. I'm inclined to speak to somewhat to what you went on record about, and I too have, you gotta know what's out there and what's a possibility, but I do have broader faith in the people, and all empires fall, for the same reasons, and it's because they've become too removed from the individuals. They've become too removed from where they came from. I find that the CEOs who actually, walk the halls and talk to the common man are much more in tune are going to build better, longer enduring companies than those who come in and believe they know it all. I have a good example of that. I won't go into it, but one company, the CEO shortly did, 3 years after he took office, he was kicked out due to an internal scandal, and the other built a business that grew and grew and grew above market rates. So, never lose touch with the common man and never forget where you came from. One of the things that I wrote down when preparing for this is, those executives who, once they're in executive positions, tell you that title doesn't matter. They're never willing to give it up, right? And to remember where you came from, to always challenge your assumptions and your intentions. It's really important. What is my intention in making this decision and making this move? Is this, am I working for me or am I working for we? And creating that mindset around a servant leadership, where you're actually helping build conditions for everyone to thrive versus conditions for me to survive.
Right.
But all empires fall when you don't have truth tellers at the table. The fool was the obvious one, but there is one theme that is really powerful, is that the good hide themselves. They put on disguises. Kent and Edgar both disguise themselves in order to try to save the king from himself.
Yep.
Or Gloucester, Edgar tries to save Gloucester from himself. Both were willing to forgive and move on. Edgar, his father, in his final moments, Edgar forgives his father for turning against him for a lie that he had believed was to be true. Right. So good always prevails. Even those who appear to have bad intentions, like Albany, he ultimately ends up doing the right thing. He checked himself. So even if you find yourself doing the wrong thing in a moment, be vigilant about doing a ruthless inventory of yourself and catch yourself and change. And that's what Albany did.
Well, and Edmund's a really interesting case study too, because, and I kind of circled it, and I wasn't quite sure we were going to cover it because it's not covered in any of the sections that were, well, it's only minorly touched on in any of the sections we're going to read today. But Edmund's a critical character because Edmund pushes the narrative forward through his actions and through his deceit. And there's a great line, we're going to cover Othello coming up here very soon on the podcast, but there's a great line in Play It As It Lays by Joan Didion, where she says, or where she writes, through one of her characters' voices in that novel. People often ask what makes Iago evil. I don't ask anymore, and that's a really interesting. That's worthy of pulling apart in the context of Othello. But in reading King Lear, people will ask what makes Edmund evil, and I don't ask that. Not after looking around in our time. We don't talk about illegitimacy in the kinds of ways that it was framed in King Lear. And that would read to our modern ears as just being ridiculous and an anachronism, right? Who cares if he's a bastard child? Who cares if he's illegitimate? But that actually means something. And this is something fundamental it's something fundamental to reality, the things that we're talking about today, right? Things that are fundamental to human nature. It's interesting. This Sunday, you talk about going to church. This Sunday in my church, one of the pastors was talking about how God pays attention. If you read the Bible carefully, God pays attention to the widows and the fatherless, right, and the foreigners, the sojourners, right, the people that in our modern society, based on our smartphones and our digital access, we don't pay attention to, right? Or if we do, we try to throw money at the problem and then run away, right? And he says that if we want to behave like Christians, basically, this is his point, we need to be paying attention to things that God pays attention to and ignoring the things that God ignores. Okay. And by the way, Jesus, also in the New Testament, throughout the New Testament, right? Helping widows, helping orphans, helping the fatherless, chastising the rich, particularly the rich young ruler, the story of the rich young ruler, who couldn't give away everything and follow him. Talk about the CEO who couldn't give up his title, right? There's a thread through Western thought here, right? And it runs through Edmund as well. And it's this idea that if you don't pay attention, this is part of that blindness, to the fatherless in particular, you are sowing the seeds of your own destruction.
Yeah, I actually kind of see this a different way, and can make it a modern analogy, going back to what Oprah said about the fact that we all want to be seen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Edmund wasn't seen. Now, he wasn't seen during that time by his father because he was illegitimate, but it could have been he was the youngest child and his father just didn't spend time with him either.
Right.
And because he wasn't seen, he had two choices to make. One was to seek revenge on that who did not see him. And the other was to go and live a fruitful life, create opportunities for himself. Yeah, the same is like Goneril versus Cordelia.
Mm-hmm.
Goneril has a choice to either, she decides to act out of fear, and she says this to her husband, is I would either be wrong acting out of fear than to be wrong acting out of trust.
Mm-hmm.
So she chose to turn against her father because she anticipated how he would behave, whereas Cordelia chose to do the right thing for her and live to her true values and lived a good life. So these are about, and she wasn't seen, and she chose a good path. And Edmund wasn't seen, and he chose a vengeful path. So, ultimately, it's about recognizing human nature, and everyone has two choice points. You can play a victim and seek revenge, or you can say, I own my destiny and I'm going to create a life for myself.
Okay, so I'm going to push back a little bit on that, but from the opposite end a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. Great.
I don't want to be a sucker.
Well,
if I'm 20 and I've grown up in this world and, I share the same things as youth from other times. So it's not any different. I distrust my elders. I can fix everything. I can't even make my own bed, but I can fix the world. I can get riled up about the injustices of the world. Whatever the activist du jour ideology of the moment is, I can go and run to that because that's the great adventure, right? Because I want to have a great adventure because I'm 20. I want to have a great adventure, right? Yeah. Everybody at 20 wants to have a great adventure. You're no different than any other 20-year-old. But okay, you think you are because you have a mobile phone. Cool. All right. So you're going to go off and have your great adventure. But in the process of having that great adventure, I'm also, because I've been exposed to all of this stuff, I have a deep well of cynicism inside of me. And so I don't want to be a sucker. So there's this tension, right? I don't want to be taken advantage of, right? And you talked about, it's interesting, you talked about how in the past, you got rapid real feedback, right? Because the gaps between distance perception and reality were closed or were tighter, maybe. Now the distance between perception and reality is more broad, right? And the feedback is not rapid. And it's very much not bona fide, as they would say down here where I live. It ain't bona fide. Yeah. It ain't the real thing. And so now I'm operating in this well of just nonsense, right? And I'm 20. And fundamentally, at the end of the day, I want to have hope. I want to have a great adventure, and I don't want to be a sucker.
Well, so this is where.
And so goneril doesn't read, or not goneril, but Cordelia doesn't read well to me. Like I'm either going to be goneril or I'm going to be Edmund. Like I'm going to pick one of those two.
That's really interesting. Like I would be Cordelia. Okay. Right. And, and I just know that about who I am because I have to live with myself.
Right.
Right.
Well, and that idea of living with yourself. So
you have to be willing to walk away. Right.
Right. I wonder if it's easier to be Cordelia when you're 40 than it is to be Cordelia when you're 20.
I don't know. So, I have an analogy that I use from, my, in third grade. Like, so I'm friends with everyone and I belong to nothing. Like, so I actually really love learning from all types of people. I belong to all different types of group, but I don't identify myself as a group.
Sure. Yeah.
And one of the reasons I remember when I was in third grade and I was part of the cool club, friends with, one of the Broncos kids and, and we were really cool and everyone wanted to hang out with us. And I bullied my best friend from 2 years old because she wasn't cool enough. And I still feel that ick in my body. And I knew at that moment that belonging was never, important enough to holding true to who I am. So like the ends don't justify, the ends don't justify the means. And so this concept around you need to live with yourself is really important. It doesn't mean that I othered the cool kids. I was still friends with them, but I would not bully. I would not subscribe to all of their behaviors.
Yeah.
But you also see what you want to see. Like, so if you only believe that there's one path, like anger and activism, or like there are role models everywhere that disprove a belief system that you have.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Right? Yeah.
And
well, the world is more than, and the world is more than just
it requires flexibility and a willingness to go against the grain, and not by there's such an innate human instinct for us to label ourselves, because if we label ourselves, we provide ourselves with certainty around who we are and how we should act, and then others are certain with how they need, will respond to us and react. And one of the things with age that is terrific is that you start to see that there is really no one path, to happiness. And when you start trying on different hats, like one thing may fit, the other doesn't. Be willing to flex and never being certain that only one path is right. And that's one of the challenges that I see in youth, is that they need, I need to go to this school because it's going to give me the path to that, it's going to be the path to happiness, or this job is going to be the path to happiness. But when you look at the people who have been some people who are happy and successful did take one path, but there is an exception to every rule.
Oh yeah.
And so being flexible, I always say, I'm not someone who's going to find a wall and stop. I'm going to find a crack. I'm going to dig under it, jump over it, find another way. But knowing who you are and what matters to you, it has got to be that inner pull, the inner pull and drive. And understanding tribal instincts is really important. Right, like the Stanford prison experiment. It's really important to say, if I were alone and not seeking to belong, how would I act? And as part of the tribe, how am I acting?
Well, and this is the challenge. So we read Gulag Archipelago on the podcast last year, and we're going to revisit Gulag Archipelago, not this year, but next year. We'll revisit that because there's some other things that we need to pull from that text that are critical for our time. We're also going to be reading a couple of other heavy books this year. So we're reading Eli Wiesel's Night, and we're also going to be reading The Power of the Powerless by Václav Havel. And there's a thread that goes through all three of those, right? From Gulag Archipelago through Eli Wiesel, through Václav Havel, and even Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, right? There's some ideas, there's an idea that goes through this. And the idea is that you can be the worst tyrant you could be as a tyrant to yourself. But you don't know that when you're 20.
Right. That's right.
You have no clue about that when you're 20. And when you lock yourself up into a tyranny that is totalizing, thus it is a totalitarian tyranny, whether that is a totalitarian tyranny pursuing a job or a life that you think other people will appreciate and will give you status, or whether it's pursuing some form of activism to change society, even though your own household might be a mess.
Right. Exactly.
Whatever the totalizing, tyrannical thing is that you are in the grasp of, you're going to wind up metaphorically behind barbed wire. You're going to wind up behind barbed wire. You're going to wind up in a problem. And I think what troubles me deeply is I think leaders are missing and have been missing for a while, although maybe they're starting to wake up, but I think leaders have been missing the opportunity to state this as baldly as possible at the lowest possible level. So I think about the kinds of people who listen to our podcast, and the kinds of people who listen to our podcast tend to be, and I said this before when we were doing Road to Serfdom, they tend to be community leaders, right? They tend to be people who are, local to the community, local to where I live, a little bit more national too, a little bit more national focus, business, government, religion, those kinds of areas, right? People who are thinking deeply about these connections, right? In a wide variety of different spaces. And the greatest possible spot they have to influence people is directly where they are at. And yet there can be totalitarianism there. There can be a totalizing idea there that, by the way, they may think is good, but it can capture them, and it can ideologically possess them the same way that Edmund was ideologically possessed, right? That's one point. Then my other thought there is, and by the way, when I was a kid, I would have been more like Cordelia, except like I probably would have taken gonorrhea and Reagan out back, and we were going to fix this problem like tomorrow. That's how that problem's going to get fixed. Yeah. Like, you're going to be old fashioned. We're going to old fashioned fix this problem because I don't want to hear the taste of my name falling out your mouth. So, because that's how I solved problems when I was a kid.
Yeah.
But and I was always the person who, like, if I saw somebody being bullied, I'm going to step into that situation, even if it's not quote unquote my business, right? Because I can't abide by that, even if it means, and many times it did when I was a kid, even if it means me taking a beating. Mm-hmm. Like, that's fine. I can take a beating. Like, that's fine.
Yep.
But I was raised sort of with that moral assertiveness. I also was born with the ability to be kind of sort of a little bit, as you can tell from the podcast, disagreeable. So it's okay, right? I'm okay with not being liked. In the world that we're
that's important. You need to be okay not being liked.
Right. And in the world we live in today, that's the other dynamic,
Yeah.
right? Where in order to tell the truth the way Cordelia does to her father, you have to be okay with the consequence of that.
Right.
And I want leaders to be okay with consequences, because the leaders that are most okay with the consequences get to be the adults in the room. And I worry we don't have enough adults in enough rooms.
Agreed. What's really interesting, so you need to, I also believe that you have to, that it's in everyone's best interest to speak the truth, right? And I
Right.
tend to use a fact-based truth and not a feels-based truth.
Yeah.
And there are leaders, as you're climbing the ladder, there are leaders who are going to appreciate that. And therefore you will continue to work together because you're only trying to get at the truth or the best solution. And then there are going to be leaders who are threatened by, the truth and your willingness. Like, I'm a change agent. I turn around businesses and I transform them. I'm going to be telling you uncomfortable truths. And if you believe, if your leader believes that it's a reflection on them, and their self-worth, then they'll be threatened by it, and you will be like pushed out, either implicitly or explicitly. But what I love about Cordelia is that, she was pushed out, and it also revealed the other, the other truth seekers and good people for the more material ones. So Burgundy showed his true cards, but
Right.
she only got to see his true cards because she was able to speak her truth. And France showed his, and he loved her for her, not for the material goods. So she's going to then therefore live a life more aligned with her values, because she's going to attract those who are like her and reveal those who aren't.
Yeah. Well, and this is good because we're going to turn the corner. We're going to talk a little bit about Cordelia. Yeah, we're going to talk a little about Cordelia. So we're going to read a little bit from Act 1, Scene 1. Right after the land gets cut up like a Thanksgiving turkey, and all of the turkeys leave the room. By the way, we didn't one pause for just one moment. I do want to kind of circle back around and close the loop on this other idea. So, how do we get more of the fool back into the corporate boardroom? How do we get the fool into the meeting? Because we need those people. And again, I do genuinely worry that in our pursuit of the good of everyone feeling comfortable, everyone being agreeable, perhaps maybe is maybe not comfortable, just agreeable. In the pursuit of having agreeable rooms, we're not allowing the fool the space to work. And by the way, I don't mean that the fool should be offensive or the fool should be clearly like, whatever. But sometimes, but sometimes like, I don't know. You need to create the space.
You need to create the conditions, like Ray Dalio in the way that he leads his companies. You always have the devil's advocate. You always have a pro versus a con debate. It has to be rewarded, and people observe what rewarding looks like. So you have to invite it to the table and reward it. And for many companies, for many leaders, you may actually need to go out and build that company. Because right now, what we're seeing is when everyone's compromising, you have a rapid deceleration towards mediocrity. Same story with Ayn Rand, right? When all you want to do is be liked and have everyone agree with you, society is destroyed because all of our standards erode in the name of being liked and not based on competence or outcome.
Well, and it's weird to me how like you would have people who would be identified in the past as iconoclasts in a wide variety of different spheres who are now part of the establishment, and people who would never have been allowed into the establishment ever are seen as being the absolute, like, just satanic living end by dominant power structures. And I don't even have to say names. People can figure it out, right? Like, this is the cultural dynamic in the West that we are in now. And the challenge, of course, with that is true iconoclasts, who may start off at the lowest end being fools and work their way up, which is, again, I mentioned Dave Chappelle. I mean, I think he started off, well, no, and I know, I've been watching that guy's career for 25 years. Like, he started off as the fool on the street corner, and now I would call him a genuine iconoclast.
But it's because he and Chris Rock don't need to be liked, right?
Right, exactly.
Right, but like, Chappelle walked away
right
from the foolery of the corporate world,
right,
because they were asking him to be something other than he was.
Correct.
I mean, that's why he still has, it's the fool.
Well, and he's got the cachet.
Stern, right? Whereas Howard Stern, he's now fallen in love so much with being revered that he can no longer see the truth.
Oh my God, Howard Stern, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's just a really great example.
No, that is a great example. Yeah, no, that's fabulous. Well, okay, so
or Neil Young.
Young. Yeah, there's another one. There's another one. Well, okay. Well, when you talk about and I'm fascinated by radio and guys who do interviews, because I mean, let me look what I'm doing now. But I mean, I'm fascinated by all of that, and the two probably. Well, I wonder if this is fundamental to generations too, because the baby boomer generation in general really liked beating each other at the game, whatever the game happened to be. So you have Howard Stern, and then on the opposite side of that, you have Rush Limbaugh, and they both liked beating each other, beating their heads. I mean, they did, and I think of I don't know if it's a Japanese or Chinese proverb, but when the elephants fight, the ground gets trampled, and there was a lot of that in the baby boomer generation. A lot of the elephants fighting. You go a couple generations down, though, where now we've got this idea of agreeableness being the highest virtue. And you talk about it framed in terms of mediocrity. That's one framing, and I would not disagree with that framing. A larger framing may be, and buddies of mine have this discussion about in sports, right? Because, the whole LeBron James versus Michael Jordan thing continues to rage in basketball. I am personally of the belief that we will never see a Tom Brady level quarterback in the NFL ever again. Like, we just won't, because that guy was fine if you didn't like him.
Yeah.
He just wanted to cut your throat out to win. That was it. He didn't care. Oh, you don't like me? Cool. Same thing with Michael Jordan. Like, I'm a Jordan. If you could see behind my camera, I'm a Jordan guy, right? Yeah. Like, he came not just to kill you, but to cut your heart out. And he didn't care if you liked him. LeBron James cares very much about who likes him on Twitter. And I don't understand that. Like, to me, that doesn't click over. And so as we've gone into this level of agreeableness, competitiveness, ambition, these things wind up conforming to these spaces. And this is where then you get, speaking of radio, to flip back to radio for just a second, you get all the people who would not have been allowed through the narrow keyhole of radio are now running podcasts. Because Joe Rogan, they weren't going to let Joe Rogan on the radio. Exactly. They never let that guy radio. They're not going to let that guy on. So just a minor observation there.
It's all about what you're striving for. And Michael Jordan was striving for their team to be the best team.
Yeah.
On the merits, right? And by challenging and setting the pace and the tone for his team, everyone else stepped up.
Right.
I say this a lot. I'd rather be respected than liked. Like, I don't really care if you like me. I want you to respect me. Right. And too many people care about being liked. And, there's lots of fine people that I like, but I don't respect the way that they make decisions.
Right.
I don't respect how they're living their lives and how they treat themselves and others. But there can be lots of reasons for why I like someone, and respect is a very different, is something very, very different.
Respect lands in that place of, and I think we see this a little bit in King Lear, but it winds up it's that combination of merit driven by competency, right? And I think we're missing something on competency, but it's merit.
We
Oh,
don't
it's
measure competency anymore. We're actually saying we don't want to measure competency because people will feel bad.
well, we don't even know how to define it, I don't think.
Exactly.
Which is weird to me. Like, how do you not know? Okay, you don't know. Okay, fine. But if you don't, you can't get to respect without merit and competency. And then you can't get to merit and competency without a baseline understanding of what the parameters of a goal are. So we're missing both the top of, and this is a cultural critique, but we're missing the top of the hierarchy in some ways. And we're also missing the bottom of the hierarchy while the middle gets hollowed out, which means, and I've been saying this for a while now on the podcast, the West is approaching a Tower of Babel or Tower of Babel moment. And the tower can't stay up.
Everything's driven by politics and emotion, which means everything is unpredictable. When you're managed by the rule of law versus human nature, there are at least guardrails that make it predictable around how you win and lose. Like in business, about 2008, they stopped doing performance reviews or goals. Well, now it's hard to find like a job description that's meaningful or understanding how you measure success in a specific role. Well, what happens when it isn't clear how success is defined, you become more political and cutthroat, and it becomes, and that's where the Tower of Babel happens, is politics will always take over when you don't have clarity of objectives, when you don't have clarity of outcomes and clarity of roles.
And then, of course, you get rule by the worst because you get people who are experts at politics.
Exactly. Everyone else drops out, moves out, it goes to something different. Which is why fascinating. Okay.
Yeah, it's a fascinating psychological study. There's a little jog there. I want to talk a little bit about the truth in Cordelia, and telling truth to power. Much is made of that in our time. Back to the book, back to the play, back to King Lear, The Tragedy of King Lear by William Shakespeare. Once again, the Folger Shakespeare Library Edition. I would encourage you to pick it up. Has great it's a smooth read, regardless of how I may have mangled the Old English here, but it is a smooth read with clearly defined stanzas. As Libby said, it's almost like a library in a book there. And I would also encourage you, by the way, and this is something that's critical, I think, for understanding Shakespeare. Shakespeare has to be absorbed in a couple of different ways. And so in preparation for these podcasts, this is just a little inside baseball. I not only read the Shakespeare, but then I also listen to it being performed, right? And there's many different performances of Shakespeare on YouTube. You can just go find any of them. It doesn't matter. Pick one and listen to it while you're reading it. And it makes the thing flow, makes the thing understandable. And then at a third level, I would recommend go out and find a film version that you can of Shakespeare, and watch that. It makes it all digestible. And what the heck, spend $7.99 on a DVD and you'll be all right. All right. So back to the play, back to Act 1. We're going to go back to Scene 1 a little bit later on, after, like I said, after everything's been sort of cut up, and Cordelia is speaking to King Lear. So we're going to pick up with stanza 255 to 260. Cordelia to Lear: I yet beseech your majesty, if, for I want that glib and oily art to speak and purpose not, since what I well intend, I'll do it too before I speak, that you make known. It is no vicious blot, murder, or foulness, no unchaste action or dishonored step that hath deprived me of your grace and favor. But even for want of that for which I am richer, a still soliciting eye, and such a tongue that I am glad I have not, though not to have it hath lost me in your liking. Lear: better thou hast not been born than not have pleased me better. France: it is but this, a tardiness in nature, what often leaves the history unspoke. What it intends to do? My lord of Burgundy, what say you to the lady? Love's not love when it is mingled with regards that stands aloof from the entire point. Will you have her? She is herself a dowry. Burgundy to Lear: royal king, give but that portion which yourself proposed, and here I take Cordelia by the hand. Duchess of Burgundy. Lear: nothing. I have sworn, I am firm. Burgundy to Cordelia. I am sorry then you have so lost a father, and you must lose a husband. Cordelia, peace be with Burgundy, since that respect and fortunes are his love. I shall not be his wife. France, fairest Cordelia, that art most rich being poor, most choice forsaken and most loved despised. Thee and thy virtues here I seize upon. Be it lawful, I take up what's cast away. Gods, 'tis stranger that from their close neglect my love should kindle to inflame respect. Thy dowerless daughter, king, thrown to my chance, is queen of us, of ours, of our fair France. Not all the dukes of watchful Burgundy can buy this unprized precious maid of me. Bid them farewell, Cordelia, though unkind. Thou losest here better where to find. Lear, thou hast her, France, let her be thine, for we have no such daughter, nor shall we ever see that face of hers again. To Cordelia, therefore be gone. Without our grace, our love, our benison, come, noble Burgundy. Flourish. All but France, Cordelia, Goneril, and Regan exit. France, bid farewell to your sisters. Cordelia, the jewels of our father, with washed eyes, Cordelia leaves you. I know what you are, and like a sister am most loath to call your faults as they are named. Love well our father. To your professed bosoms I commit him. But yet, alas, stood I within his grace, I would prefer him to a better place. So farewell to you both. Regan, prescribe not us our duty. Goneril, let your study be to content your lord who hath received you at fortune's alms. You have obedience scanted, and well are worth the want that you have wanted. Cordelia, time shall unfold what plighted cunning hides. Who covers faults at last with shame derides. Well may you prosper. France, come, my fair Cordelia. France and Cordelia exit. That little clip right there, a little piece right there of a much larger dynamic that's occurring between between France, Burgundy, Goneril, Regan, Cordelia, and King Lear. It's like watching a movie clip. And the reason why I pulled that is because Cordelia, as Libby has already said, Cordelia committed all the way to the end on her principles. See, the truth will set you free, free of influence, free of pulling the levers of power, but not free of accountability for your actions. There are some people in the leadership development space who would say that Cordelia should not have spoken the truth. Cordelia should have shut her mouth and stayed in a position of power, eaten the crap that was delivered by Goneril and Regan, bided her time, and then sprung the trap. They would say that you can't influence from the outside, and so you must be on the inside. They would also say that Cordelia can't tell truth to power unless she's near to the source of power. But Cordelia understood something that I think a lot of those folks who would advocate for that position miss. And I think it is something that is important in our fractured age. No longer are we in an era of mass media and mass audiences and mass consumers and even mass consequences. We are now fully, firmly in the era of micro audiences, micro consequences, and micro interactions that, of course, have major implications. Don't get me wrong, but they are still at the smallest, at least to this point, possible level, which is, again, one of those reasons why I'm not really too worried about one world government. Folks like Cordelia don't get to just skip away into a consequenceless future. Nor does she make everyone, as we already mentioned, happy with her truth-telling. That wasn't her job. Her job was to understand the difference between principles and position. And truth-tellers may lose materially, but they may win spiritually. You have to be comfortable with your past. You have to be comfortable with who you were and what you will become. And Libby's already mentioned this as well. But sometimes the lure of power and influence closes people's mouths to saying the truth with the 3 C's: clarity, candor, and courage. I do fundamentally believe that it is those three C's that we need now more so than ever. And people who are willing to accept the consequences for speaking with clarity, candor, and courage, whatever they may be. And by the way, we are now in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And clarity, candor, and courage has proven to be just as in a short supply as I always thought it was, or at least I always suspected it was. And so we really need to pick up this. We really need to pick up this lesson. We really need to pick up this lesson about principle, the difference between principles and positions. We really need to pick up this lesson from Cordelia. And by the way, this is just a small sample. She consistently, character-wise, walks this out through King Lear all the way to, well, to the clearing at the end of the path, as Stephen King would say. A different Stephen King, not the one you see on Twitter. A different Stephen King, the one that I know, the one who wrote The Gunslinger. That guy. Libby, much is made of telling truth to power. Much is made of raising your fist and protesting. I'm thinking in our contemporary moment right now of events going on in Tennessee, in the state government in Tennessee. If you want to Google what those are, you can. They will all be wrapped up by the time you hear this podcast. But that is just the latest example of, I don't know, sort of the marketing of truth to power versus the actual telling of truth to power with actual consequences. How can leaders separate the marketing from the actual thing? Because the actual thing has actual consequences. Like when you talked about job applications, okay, there's a way to frame this. I see a lot of job applications, that say they're gobbledygook as far as what they want you to do. But at the bottom in bold print, it says, our organization has determined that COVID-19 requirements must be met, so you must have a COVID-19 shot before you can show up to interview for this job. And I just go, nope. I'm not looking for a job right now, but like if I were, no, then I'm out. Like that's not, there's principles. And then there's the position. Do those principles have consequences? For sure. And I wonder how many folks understand the difference between these two things. So how do we tell the truth to power? How do we keep our principles as our position? Or maybe we don't. Maybe we just need to be position-driven people that wave around with the wind.
Position-driven people.
yeah. They like just wave around with the wind. I'm a negotiator. Like I understand the value of positions. I'm not knocking positions. And at the end of the day, you have to have a principle. Omar from The Wire, you have to have a code.
Yeah, I mean, if principles, if positions aren't bound by principles, you get what we have today.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting what you talk about what we've seen over the last 3+ years. I always knew that politics was a lot of rhetoric and theater. I did not realize the extent of it that was theater, and how much of it is meant to just drive our emotions and to keep us focused on what they want us to focus on while they move their agendas through. It's not courage when you're saying what everyone is saying. Even when you act like you're saying it in anger and conviction, all I see is someone who's towing the party line.
Yeah.
So I tend to be I tend to be an outcomes-based individual. And you had identified the owls versus the hummingbirds in one of our early conversations, and
yep.
I was definitely more of a hummingbird when I was in my 20s and 30s. Um, and now that I have been through many cycles, economic, political, familial, you can see certain trends. And one of those on the political side is the rhetoric doesn't ever deliver the outcomes that are promised. I don't have to look far from the streets of San Francisco and the homeless crisis that was the top of Newsom's priority list in 2010 has only accelerated into severity. I don't have to look farther beyond the streets of San Francisco, where we're basically conducting assisted suicide with the drug epidemic and the homeless epidemic. That those outcomes are not outcomes of people who care. So you can, after you start to see cycles of false promises and false prophets, you then need to start to look for where the truth is, and start to act locally and as an individual. George Carlin, who I never appreciated in the days, he was saying, they don't care about you, but you don't want to get to they being the government, they being big business. That is true. At the end of the day, like, the power and elite is very insular, and they're really focused on continuing to advance their own positions. Whether they're aware of it or not is another story. But you do have the ability to act locally. You do have the ability individually and in a decentralized manner to live a life worth living. And our role as leaders is to do the right thing because it's the right thing, and just put one foot in front of another and ignore the noise.
Let me ask you this question, which is always the pushback on this when I say something like this, or I do a shorts episode that basically talks about the difference between principles and positions, or I write a blog post, and I've been writing blog posts about this, books about this stuff for years now, right? The pushback I always get is, invariably, the pushback that I get is, well, it's so hard, Hassan, to know what's right.
Give me a break, really?
Oh yeah, oh, that's still floating around out here, and I have the good grace not to laugh, not out loud anyway. But it does make me the fact that rolls so easily off of people's tongues. And the fact that
they're mistaking positions for principles.
Right. And they're also mistaking principles for, and don't get me wrong, they run parallel. They do run on parallel tracks. In some cases they intersect, but principles aren't necessarily morals or even ethics, though they do run on parallel tracks. Okay. So, like, and by the way, my response to that is always, well, no, I mean, when you don't do the thing that you're supposed to do, and
How do you feel?
Right. Well, and you knew you didn't do the thing you were supposed to do. Yeah. There's another old school concept I'm going to hit you with. That's called sin. and then that's when I laugh, and then I walk away. Usually leaving those people kind of just flummoxed and just standing there looking at me. I don't think things are as complex. No, not things. Let me be very specific here. I do not think the decision to do what is right is as complex as people make it out to be. I just don't think that it is. And maybe I haven't been in areas of enough complexity. You mentioned San Francisco and the homeless. I think crisis is beyond, is not an appropriate even word to use for this. The absolute total societal collapse of the Tenderloin district of San Francisco is as an unbelievable black eye of an indictment on California in general, and California in particular, and America in general. Okay.
In the coal mine.
Oh my God. And by the way, I would not have believed it if I hadn't gone there a few years ago with my wife and kids and seen it like up close. I would not have believed that it was that bad, and have gotten worse since then. Would not have believed it. Thought it was all rhetoric and blown out. Talk about rhetoric. Thought it was rhetoric and theater. Nope, it's not rhetoric and theater, folks. It actually is that bad. The unprincipled people understand that the system is run by politics. That's how Gavin Newsom gets to the top, because he's unprincipled. He understands he's got competency in that space. I'll grant him that.
Space. Yes.
Yeah. And so the people who would be competent at fixing the problem with principles eject out of the system. And many of them, by the way, post-COVID, pack up their bags and go to Utah.
Or Texas.
Or right. or Oregon.
Florida.
or Florida. Or Tennessee. Or anywhere else other than where they, right. And what you're left with, and we saw this most recently in the most recent Chicago elections in 2023.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Well, but like, who's left to vote? And so it's going to be a self-fulfilling cycle of nonsense.
Right.
Who's at a certain point, you're not draining a swamp anymore. Okay, I'll frame it this way. At a certain point, I used to live in Detroit. I lived in Detroit for a few years in my early 20s. Rode the bus around Detroit, actually, to go to my 4 different jobs back in the day. And on the bus in Detroit was not for the faint of heart back in the day. And they've cleaned up Detroit. I mean, Detroit's gone through some interesting things, and there's a little bit of a renaissance going on. It has been for a few years, and that's good, by the way, for Detroit. But in order for that renaissance to begin, Detroit had to, and there was a corrupt mayor, of course, Kwame Kilpatrick. But there was a person in his administration who decided, we got to knock down these buildings. We got to start somewhere. We got to go after the slumlords who haven't maintained the buildings and have allowed Devil's Nights and Halloween nights to just burn through the city for the last 30 freaking years. Like, we're not going to allow this anymore. One person decided that and got the ball rolling. And yes, Kwame Kilpatrick was corrupt in the court. It was a court of a corrupt king. The man went to jail for sending text messages to his mistress. By the way, your text messages can be subpoenaed, folks. Let's keep that in mind. They are public record. My God, how did he not know this? Anyway, also for, hiring his relatives and doing other corrupt things. Okay, cool. But that was the beginning of the Renaissance of Detroit, because one principled person who we don't know the name of and probably never will was like, no, this we're done. That's the Cordelia in King Lear's court. Where's the Cordelia in San Francisco? I think a lot of people are asking that, by the way. Where is that person that's inside that just says, you know what? You got gubernatorial hair and you may fire me tomorrow, but this has to stop.
Well, this is that theme that is through King Lear, with the good people are in disguise. Like, Kent goes into disguise in order to help, King Lear, protect King Lear from himself.
Yeah.
And the same is true for Edgar, who acts as poor Tom.
Right.
And the nameless servant who kills Cornwall.
Yep.
So these stories are of the individuals who do the right thing. And ultimately, like the house of cards comes falling down. That is the faith that I have in humanity. And when you're talking about the one world order, that's where I also hold some faith in, is the power of the individuals. Working inside. They're not the narcissists who need to be seen. They're not the narcissists who are doing the right thing in order to be rewarded. They're doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Right. One of the things that's beautiful about where we are in the digital age is that all of the playbooks by all of the corporations and all the politicians were exposed because of the decentralized nature of the internet. And why they want to censor the internet so much is because, it was hard. Like, they were playing whack-a-mole with the truth.
Right.
And, there are people, yes, we eject out, but I'm a big believer that it's very hard to change a system from within. You have to change it from the outside. I call it outside in transformation, but you need to go out and build what good looks like, and it will attract those who are like you, that those who will do the right thing because it's the right thing exist. They're the exception, not I wouldn't say they're the exception. They're just not visible because they're not driven by visibility. They're not
Right.
driven by their ego. They're driven by doing the right thing. And that, it's kind of like how many introverts do you need to overcome an extrovert? You've got probably 50% if the world is introverts, 50% are extroverts, and you need, 8 introverts to overcome 1 extrovert.
Yeah.
It's probably the same with the ego driven versus the servant driven leader, right?
Yeah.
And they're there. We just need to create conditions. Like if you've gone to Utah or Central Oregon, you're creating a place outside of the dystopia for people to come to. John Galt could have done that in Atlas Shrugged. Instead, he was keeping the good people from doing the good work.
Right.
But you could have created a place where you set the example and the good came. You could say Florida is trying to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's one of the reasons why, like in July, we're going to cover the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence yet again on this podcast. I mean, we're going to do it again because I do not think it is rhetoric. It may have been when I think it was Ronald Reagan, when Ronald Reagan said it, initially. And it might have been John F. Kennedy. I might be putting on Reagan just for the sake of putting on Reagan. But I do believe the United States, for all of our flaws and black eyes and monumental problems, is still the last best hope for, let's be grandiose, the last best hope for humanity. Because there is a system of checks and balances that persists in, and you mentioned the rule of law, persists in the rule of law, which is why it's so disturbing, the ideological capture of the law schools.
Right.
That's even more disturbing to me than finance. Finance is one thing, money, okay. But the law, now we're getting into existential things here.
Yep.
Now we're getting into who gets prosecuted and who doesn't. Is there a standard for everyone, regardless of money or power? And by the way, if you want to assert that there's never been one standard for everybody, regardless of money and power, is there at least the attempt to get to a standard? Because if there's not even the attempt, if we are now cynically throwing the attempt out, if we're saying, the attempt was never real, so we're just going to jettison the whole thing. What's that in W.B. Yeats? The Falcon can't hear the falconer, second coming.
Yeah.
The blood dim tide. Yeah, that's what you're welcoming, because then it's anarchy. Then it is man. It's a Hobbesian nightmare that we have not even begun to understand. And so the United States is worth protecting. The Republic is worth defending. The Constitution is worth talking about and examining and knowing. And for leaders, that kind of knowledge has to undergird your work.
The mob is never right. And that's one of the foundations for us, the U.S. being a republic and not a true democracy. Is that mob rules will dictate what individuals do that they ordinarily wouldn't do.
But a monarchy isn't right. A monarchy isn't right either. I mean, then you wind up with Louis XV.
No, completely agree. I mean, there is, mobs can, total populations and groups can, be virtuous, but there can get to a place where people stop thinking. So for example, when you call half of the country evil or deplorable versus misguided, I believe that every individual I do believe that every individual has the propensity for good or bad.
Right.
I believe that people can change. I don't believe that you are a fixed state in your personality. And as long as you believe that, and people are given the opportunity, to repent and to be good, like Albany was, like you can, that's the foundation, having belief in humanity and that humans can always choose to do the right thing even if they haven't in the past, is what we can do to move forward, and not get into a dystopia thinking that the world will end because of
Right.
where we are today. Yeah,
Yeah.
you have to
Yeah.
believe in humanity.
Well, you have to have I call it hard-headed optimism.
Yeah,
Um, and I don't
pragmatic optimist is what I would
pragmatic
say.
optimism. Hey, that's good. I'm gonna borrow that. I'm a pragmatic optimist. I don't think there's anything wrong with pragmatism. I think it passion is fine, but passion's like fire. It can either cook your meat or it can burn your house down. And passion has to be directed.
Exactly, right.
And you talk about guardrails. We mentioned guardrails a couple of times. We relied for the majority of the 20th century and for a good chunk of the 21st. And this is now, we've now started to see this sort of fall apart, but we've relied on the people who proclaim themselves to be leaders to maintain those guardrails. And when the leaders themselves are pulling up the guardrails and putting them in the field and lighting them on fire, running away and telling us there were never any guardrails to begin with, now we've got a problem. And the problem is with, again, leadership, which is why we're doing what we're doing
This
here.
is why measurement is so important and outcomes are so important. So, that the equal application of the law, like we can all identify exceptions to where it wasn't, where someone like a Kennedy got off because of who he was. And people can see that, but there's going to be an exception for every one of those rules as well. But at least looking for, are we trying to dial it in to be as perfect as possible? Recognizing that there's always going to be an error, not throwing away the entire system, but identifying where it's flawed and fixing it. And that's what we've lost is nuance, which is a very common phrase, but we've lost nuance. We've lost relativity, we've lost context, and the small things now are perceived as the biggest things on the planet as problems. And so measurement is so important, knowing where you're going, how you measure success. Instead, we're getting rid of that and we're letting emotion drive everything. And objectivity and reason are gone. For those who are for those who are currently leading the country, I'm not saying that across the board, right?
No. I'm going to go here. Yeah. 2 + 2 still equals 4 at my local wastewater treatment plant.
Yes.
Because if it doesn't, I get poop in my water.
Yeah, right.
Or the bridge falls down. Or my gate doesn't work. And I don't really care about the color of the person's skin who's doing the 2 + 2 = 4.
Not when I want the bridge to work and not fall, or the plane to fly,
or to not have, whatever in my water. Correct. Right. So 2 + 2 still equals 4. Merit and competency still matter. And what we measure matters as much as what is being measured.
Exactly.
And how we measure matters as much as what is being measured. Let's turn our corner. We're wrapping up here. We spent a little bit of time with Libby, and I want to once again thank her for coming on the podcast. Always invigorating conversation with Libby Unger. So let's turn the corner a little bit here. Now let's talk about the failure of the Apollonian. Let's talk about the failure of the eye, and then the Dionysian lurking in the basement. Let's talk a little bit about Edmund, the bastard. Back to the tragedy of King Lear. Act 1, Scene 2. We're going to do a few stanzas here and there. We're going to kind of jump around a little bit because I want to get the words of Edmund out there. I want to give us a little bit of a brief look at this fellow. King Lear, Act 1, Scene 2. Enter Edmund, the bastard. Edmund, thou nature art my goddess. To thy law my services are bound. Wherefore should I stand in the plague of custom and permit the curiosity of nations to deprive me, for that I am some 12 or 14 moonshines lag of a brother? Why, bastard, why? Wherefore base? When my dimensions are as well compact, my mind is generous, and my shape as true as honest madam's issue. Why brand they us with baseness, bastardy, base? Who in the lusty stealth of nature take more composition and fierce quality than doth within a dull, stale, tired bed go to the creating a whole tribe of fops, got tween asleep and wake? Well then, legitimate Edgar, I must have your land. Our father's love is to the bastard Edmund, as to the legitimate. Fine word, legitimate. Well, my legitimate, if this letter speed and my invention thrive, Edmund the base shall top the legitimate. I grow, I prosper. Now gods, stand up for bastards. Then Gloucester comes in, speaks to Edmund. He exits. End of Act 1, Scene 2. Edmund, this is the excellent foppery of the world, that when we are sick in fortune, often the surfeits of our own behavior, we make guilty of our disasters the sun, the moon, and the stars, as if we were villains on necessity, fools by heavenly compulsion, knaves, thieves, and treacherous by spherical predominance, drunkards, liars, and adulterers by enforced obedience of planetary influence, and all that we are evil in by a divine thrusting on. An admirable evasion of whoremaster man to lay his gauchish disposition on the charge of a star. My father compounded with my mother under the dragon's tail, and my nativity was under Ursa Major, so that it follows I am rough and lecherous. I should have been that I am, had the maidenliest star in the firmament twinkled on my bastardizing. Edgar, and enter Edgar, and pat he comes, like the catastrophe of the old comedy. My cue is villainous melancholy, with a sigh like Tom O'Bedlin. Oh, these eclipses do portend these divisions. Fa, sol, la, mi. He's going to talk with Edgar a little bit. He's going to chat him up. And then we're going to leapfrog a little bit over here to Act 2. And we're going to go to Scene 3 in Act 2. And we're going to juxtapose Edmund's complaint with probably the most famous soliloquy in King Lear, Edgar's song. Edgar, in Scene 3, Act 2. Edgar, I heard myself proclaimed, and by the happy hollow of a tree escaped the hunt. No port is free, no place that guard and most unusual vigilance does not attend my taking. Whiles I may escape, I will preserve myself, and am bethought to take the basest and most poorest shape that ever pernery and contempt of man brought near to beast. My face I'll grime with filth, blanket my loins, elf all my hairs in knots, and with presented nakedness outface the winds and persecutions of the sky. The country gives me proof and precedent of bedlam beggars, who with roaring voices strike in their numbered and mortified arms pins, wooden pricks, nails, springs of rosemary, and with this horrible object from low farms, poor pelting villagers, sheepcotes and mills, sometime with lunatic bands, sometime with prayers, enforce their charity. Poor turtly god, poor Tom, that's something yet. Edgar, I nothing am. Then he goes to prepare himself to potentially save the king. Edgar and Edmund are two sides. And we've touched on it, now we're going to address it directly. They're two sides of a Western idea. Edmund, of course, is a bastard, back when illegitimacy actually meant something. Actually meant quite a lot. And I still do believe it matters quite a lot, but we've moved it from the material level to to the spiritual level, even though there are material consequences for illegitimacy that we can see in any and all of our major cities. And then we have Edgar, who is willing to fall on his sword, not only speak to truth to power, but also take action in that truth to engage with the Dionysian forces that Edmund, and even in his cold rationality, represents. Edmund represents the rational Dionysian. He represents rational decadence. I hate you and I seek revenge. There's many characters like this in Shakespeare. I would argue that Hamlet's uncle in Hamlet is this character. I would argue that Iago in Othello is this character. I would even argue that a couple of the characters in Taming of the Shrew are these characters as well. Shakespeare plays with this psychological idea in the pursuit of fiction, in the pursuit of literature. He plays with this idea of the Dionysian as being rational, but also being decadent, driven by these decadent emotions. We talked a lot about emotion on this podcast, but driven by decadent emotions, driven to pursue what is in quote unquote their nature. And then, by the way, in a world before, a good 300 years before there was any psychological language, Shakespeare understood that the drivers of these psychological behaviors were murky and Chthonian, and they lived all the way down deep in the dark heart of man. Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceitful above all else. Who can know it, right? Now, there's two other folks in here. We talked about Cordelia, but we haven't really addressed Regan and Goneril. And they have female agency. And this is something that Shakespeare gets knocked very often for how he portrays his women, either as being too shrewish. That's the feminist critique against Taming of the Shrew, Catherine in Taming of the Shrew. But then you also get the feminist critique against Cordelia. The feminists somehow miss that Regan and Goneril drive much of the narrative of King Lear. They are women in power. They are women who are, in the parlance of our time, to be believed. Believe all women. I'm old enough to remember when that was a thing. I'm also old enough to remember when Supreme Court nominees couldn't define what a woman was. Okay. All right. Once again, evidence of the Dionysian, right? If the Apollonian fails, this is the lesson for leaders. If the eye of cold rationality fails, the Dionysian always lurks in the basement. There's always Chthonian, Mother Nature, darker things, earthier things, uglier things to fall back into. And of course, this is what we build up against, right? Edmund, in his seemingly Apollonian nature, because by his words, he rejects all of that Dionysian nonsense. The stars, get the heck out of town. I'm not driven by the stars. I'm driven by rationality. I'm rationally pursuing revenge. But he was manipulated by female nature without even being aware of it. Cornwall, on the other hand, we haven't really touched on Cornwall too much, but Cornwall was aware of the manipulation and he went along with it anyway. He's like, no, this works for me. I'm going to do this until the wheels fall off, and they fell off pretty quickly. And then Edgar's soliloquy, his song, such as it were, acts as an anchor for The Child Roll into the Dark Tower Came by Robert Browning, whose great first line of that poem is, my first thought was he lied in every word. Love that line. There's a lot between Edmund and Edgar and Regan and Goneril, but again, they represent the Apollonian and the Dionysian. They represent the pull of villainy. And we've talked a lot about that on this podcast because King Lear almost engenders it, but the pull of villainy, right? In a time of chaos, a time of venal appetites and pursuits, a time of decadence when everything's really falling apart. how do we lose? We've kind of maybe talked a little bit about this already, Libby, but how can leaders address that chaos and that villainy without losing their ethics? Pragmatic optimism, maybe that's the way. Or lamenting even the reality of people. How do you maintain hope? How do you stay a happy warrior?
Yeah, I think we've touched a lot on this. I always come back to the concept of that we all have good and bad in us. And I look for the exceptions with the good and creating conditions for the good to come out versus focusing on the bad.
Yeah.
This also is about, I mentioned, change comes from, outside in versus inside out. And that means you need to be willing to walk away. You need to be willing to walk alone. And none of this is said to be easy.
No.
Right. I'm not trying to say, oh, you just walk away and the world creates a fine place for yourself, but you need to be able to walk away, to stay clear, to stay true to who you are. And you will attract others like you to set the stage for what good looks like.
I like that. I like that. I like that. I wrote that down. Build what good looks like. I love that.
And this also comes from the concept of servant leadership too. It didn't occur to me until this year that I no longer hear we. I no longer hear what we can do together when talking to employees about how they can contribute to a company, or even companies talking to employees. It's all about, what are you going to do for me? Tell me what you did, I did. And there's nothing is accomplished with an I. And the concept of servant leadership is, it would almost be frowned upon to talk about in today's corporate environment, where you're actually serving others, because by nature of being a servant, you're not in power. But I look at the concept of all tides rise. A rising tide raises all ships. If I'm helping you to become the best version of yourself, whether you're someone who works for me, whether you're a peer, or whether you're like a board member, investor, whomever, my goal is to unleash your potential. And in doing so, I also unleash my own, because I learn, I create more opportunity for myself, yada, yada, yada. But at the end of the day, like, where's this concept about creating conditions for all to thrive? And where is the we, and not the we as a tribe, but we as a team, we as an organization, we as an ecosystem? How are we all working together to help diverse individuals with diverse needs and aspirations thrive?
I think we're at the end of division, and maybe I'm only speaking from my point of view here, my end of the telescope, from what I'm seeing in my local community. But I do think that we collectively have hit the end of the cycle of the I. Now, don't get me wrong. It's ascended so high that it's going to take, the message has gone up so high. It's going to take a while for the we message to get up. I mean, it's going to take a while. There's still a lot of nonsense it has to push through. From where I'm sitting, I do think that we are getting it. Not maybe the people who are leading us, maybe they aren't getting it. And by the way, I mean, after a certain break point, I mean, and in politics, I go above the state level, probably not. But from the local level up, yeah, the we is coming back for sure. Right.
And the we as the we as a civilization, right?
Yeah.
We as a tribe, seeing individuals for what you can learn from them, embracing our individual diversity.
Right.
And true diversity of experience, diversity of thought, all of that kind of fun stuff. But as they say, I think it's the Chinese character for chaos is also the one for opportunity. And this is in the midst of the chaos, people are looking for something that adds meaning, and they're realizing that these vacuous promises and externally validating things are not fulfilling. They're looking for something that gives them an enduring purpose, an enduring set of meaning.
Well, and I think you're seeing this culturally in the decline of the superhero film.
Oh.
So we've reached the end of the superhero film. I can pretty definitively say that.
Yeah.
I think that genre is dead. It had a good, I'll push it to 30. It had a good 30 years. It warped everything because of the amount of money that Disney put behind Marvel films, which are really, quite frankly, I love how you put a rhetoric in theater. They're rhetoric in theater with spectacle on top. Yeah. And they had nothing to say after the spectacle.
Right.
Remarkable silence after the spectacle, even though there are a wealth of stories to be told in the canon. Trust me, I know. I collected comic books for many years. There's a wealth of stories to be told in the canon, but the stories don't match the rhetoric in the theater. And so if what you're selling is rhetoric in theater through a heightened cultural message of I, not we, I am Iron Man, I am Shazam, I am Superman. What's Batman's famous line? I'm a Batman guy. I'm Batman. Okay, well, yeah, okay.
The rhetoric and the puffery isn't delivering.
Right.
I think we start, you saw it early on, with PR and corporations. And after a while, we're like, oh, they're going to come out with a PR statement. And then it started moving, to the puffery and politics, and the puffery. Everything was puffery and statements that we are. But when you looked at what was actually delivering, you're like, just hogwash. All you care about is money and power. So all of the, everything, all of the gilding is like starting to wash away, and people are starting to look at real sources of value and truth. Yeah. And they're finding it locally. But if you believe in the human condition, if you study history, if you understand human nature, you can have faith in the cycles of time. And know, hey, it may not be easy. You may be the person who sacrificed on the altar, but at least you get to live with yourself.
I was gonna ask you, what can we take away from this? How can we stay on the path? What can we take away from King Lear? And I think that's a good takeaway. I think that's the takeaway.
And you may end up with, like, you've got spiritual wealth. You may end up with material wealth. You may not, but at least you can live with yourself.
Yep. Yeah.
And the people who are more spiritual seem to be happier.
Well,
you're not chasing after the ephemeral.
Well, and fundamentally, I mean, it's one of those things where I've thought for many years, I'm going to be dead a lot longer than I'm going to be alive. So since I'm going to be dead a lot longer than I'm going to be alive, I should probably be worried about that kind of stuff and making sure that all that's aligned, because eternity is a really, really long time. Like, really long time.
Even if there is no life after death.
Yeah, even if we take
like the moral
Pascal's
codes,
right.
The
Pascal's wager
that are dictated all make life better.
Right.
Like, why do I want to take dictates and mandates from people who can't manage their own households, whose kids are strife with addiction, and or health policy from people who are clearly anorexic or have problems with overeating.
Right, exactly. Yeah, like, I'm not gonna. Sorry, no.
Got your own house in order.
Right.
I'm really not interested in you managing mine.
Exactly. Well, and that's where the Jordan Peterson idea of make your own bed comes from.
Right.
And this is where I look at people who are in activist positions who yell and scream a lot about a lot of things, and I wonder as I read their tweets and their proclamations and I watch their performative acts, and I wonder, what's your family like?
And as an individual, I have compassion for them, right? I
Oh,
don't want
absolutely.
them
Yeah.
to be struggling. I want them to
Yeah.
find happiness with themselves. But I'm not going to take rules and orders from people who don't, as you said.
Right.
Their own house isn't in order.
Gotta
As
get
we
your own
say
house
in
in
the
order.
12 steps, like, focus on your side of the sidewalk, I'll focus on mine, and we'll be really happy. And that means I keep mine clean.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. All right.
Well, in turning the corner on King Lear, I think we've determined what Libby believes is the larger message for leaders for staying on the path. I will say this. King Lear is often framed as a tragedy. Matter of fact, on the back of the Dover Thrift edition, it says that first performed about 1605, King Lear is one of the most relentlessly bleak of Shakespeare's tragedies, probably written between Othello and Macbeth when the playwright was at the peak of his tragic power. Lear's themes of filial ingratitude, injustice, and the meaninglessness of life in a seemingly indifferent universe are explored with unsurpassed power and depth. Yeah, okay. If you just read it for what it is on the surface, absolutely. It's relentlessly nihilistic. It is bleak. There is an existential struggle, and the universe does, to Neil deGrasse Tyson or Richard Dawkins' glee, I would imagine, reveal itself to be just about as dead end and meaningless as you would think if you came from that particular set of ideological assumptions. And yet, we're not reading things into the text that are not there. There are multiple interpretations of Shakespeare's work, just as there are multiple interpretations of King Lear. Just like when you watch a movie, or a television show like a Succession or a Yellowstone, you have to contextualize Shakespeare to your moment. And by the way, this is why Shakespeare will survive both the nuclear weapons and the cockroaches. If it comes to that, they'll still be doing Shakespeare in China or in India or among whoever is left, because it's human nature, not English nature or white European nature or patriarchal nature. You could switch around all of the roles in King Lear, as Akira Kurosawa did in Ron, and it would still be the same, because the drivers are human. Are the drivers of humanity bleak? Is there injustice in the world? Yes. But there's also hope. There's also optimism. There's also building what good looks like. I use that a lot from Libby today. There's understanding the difference between principles and positions, and there's not getting caught up in spectacle or rhetoric and theater. There's not getting distracted. There's standing firm in the face of chaos and villainy. And just like Cordelia does, and many others in King Lear, including Edgar, silently, or maybe even out loud, but silently asserting yourself and saying out loud just one word: no. Leaders, we have to learn the power of the no. I think that's the biggest lesson from King Lear. If there's anything we could take from Cordelia, it's the power of the no. If there's anything we could take from Edgar, it's the power of what you do after the no has been given, regardless of how many Edmonds or Gloucesters or Kents or attendants or servants who's surrounding you. The characters really don't matter. None of them are going to help you. at the end of that existential struggle and the clearing at the end of that path. Now, Lear got lucky. Cordelia was with him there at the end. That's luck. In our modern era, Lear would probably be written, and I get the sense that the father in Succession and potentially whatever they do with the Kevin Costner character in Yellowstone is going to wind up alone in a room by himself. And it usually is a man, by the way, ladies, full of regret. But it doesn't have to be that way. We have agency. We have choice. We can take the lessons from King Lear. We could take the lessons from Shakespeare. We could apply them to our lived lives. And we can build a better society and culture starting at the lower local level. We could build a we together where we can all see with collective eyes and create a vision for the future that's worth defending. I want to thank my guest, Libby Unger, for coming on the podcast today. Always a great pleasure to have her. We will have her on again. There's another couple of books coming up in a few months. We're going to have her on again. Libby, is there anything you would like to promote today on the podcast? Anywhere where people can find you, or where you want to be found, or do you want to be found even?
No, I don't hide. But you can always find me on LinkedIn, Libby Unger, and ping me there. Or email me directly at libby@luminola.com, and you can add that to the show notes. But this has been fabulous. Don't lose hope. Do the right thing, because the only person that you need to be able to live with is yourself. And do the right thing because it's the right thing to do.
And with that, I'm out. Listen and subscribe to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast on all the major podcast players that you listen to podcasts on, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and even Spotify. And please leave a 5-star review if you like the show. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to make sure that this show gets into the ears of the leaders who need to hear it. And of course, tell all your friends. If you want to get started on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing's products and services can help your team do that. Check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We also have a video-based subscription service, that's software as a service, that can help your team become better at the individual level. 60 modules and over 100 hours of video and written content for you at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com. We've also got books that will help you and your team grow. Pick up a copy today of My Boss Doesn't Care, 100 Essays on Disrupting Your Workplace by Disrupting Your Boss, and subscribe to the Little Red podcast I launched earlier this year with the same name as that Little Red book. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership, co-written with contributions from Bradley Madigan. This is the book for right now that was written for leaders right now. Pick up a copy by heading over to 12rulesleadersbook.com/now. That's 12rulesleadersbook.com/now. You pay for shipping, and you'll get a copy of my second book as well. Finally, you can get all these books in paperback, hardcover, or as ebooks on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place online you order books. Finally, HSCT Publishing is on YouTube. Like and subscribe to the video version of the Leadership Lessons for the Great Books podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing and hit the subscribe button. You'll get our weekly video updates, which is the video version of this podcast. And, of course, you're going to want to subscribe to my other podcast. That's right, I do more than one. The Hasan Sorrells Presents audio experience, where I talk more casually with a broader range of people about all matters that matter in the world today, from arts all the way to analytics. All right, that's it for me.